The question, what if Germany had won World War II, is probably one of the most frequently asked historical questions one can find on Google. This scenario fascinates people worldwide, not least because of the immense impact World War II had on global history. From the rise of the USA as a world power, through the Cold War, to the moon landing and modern medicine, many significant post-war events and developments are directly or indirectly related to the outcome of this war. Our current world order is largely based on the fact that Germany lost this war. In popular media such as The Man in the High Castle, Fatherland, or Wolfenstein, this alternative historical scenario is explored, often in an exaggerated and dramatized way. But what might a more objective examination of this hypothetical scenario look like? First, it's important to emphasize that reality is influenced by countless variables. Therefore, the question of a world in which Germany won World War II is not easy to answer. There are infinitely many variables to consider. How would it have won the war? What political, military, and economic decisions would have led to this? What alliances and resistances would have existed? The difficulty of answering this question can easily be illustrated with an example. What if Germany had won the Battle of Stalingrad? Would it have led to a victory over the Soviet Union? Or would it have prolonged the war in the East, so that Berlin would have to be destroyed by an atomic bomb in November or December 1945 before Germany capitulated? Or what if the plot by Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg and the assassination attempt on Hitler in the summer of 1944 had succeeded? Would the war in the West have ended sooner? Would the Western Allies have turned with the Wehrmacht against the Soviet Union? Or what if the Germans had completed the atomic bomb before the USA? And these are just military variables. One could also approach this question from a political variable. What if Germany had pursued a more moderate and prudent course and never declared war on the USA in solidarity with the Japanese? Would the USA possibly never have entered the war? How would a non-entry of the USA into the war have affected things? Therefore, there are a multitude of answers to this question, and each viewer can imagine their own scenario that makes more sense to them. But a plausible and interesting what-if for us would be the following. Starting from the assumptions that with the entry of the USA into the war in Europe, the defeat of the Axis powers on the continent is sealed, and Germany in the long term had little chance against the numerical superiority and the overwhelming material power of the Soviet army, we must primarily change these two variables to invent a more realistic scenario in which Germany still wins World War II. For simplicity, let's set the following additional parameters for our fictional scenario. History unfolds exactly as we know it from history books until 1939. Germany peacefully annexes the Sudetenland, where Germans have lived for centuries but have been separated from the Reich since 1918, without firing a shot. Afterward, the rest of Czechoslovakia is dismantled following the Munich Conference, and the majority of it is annexed by Germany. There is also a unification with Austria and an attack on Poland, in which Poland is shattered. However, there is never a secret pact with the Soviet Union, so Stalin does take parts of eastern Poland, but this leads to initial confrontations between Germany and the Soviet Union. The first skirmishes on the eastern border in 1939 do not yet lead to a major war between the two, and Germany retains most of Poland and liberates the ethnically German corridor at Danzig, restoring the land connection to East Prussia and Königsberg. With the onset of 1940, however, much changes contrary to known history. France and Great Britain have declared war on Germany in solidarity with Poland and begin to amass their armies in the West. However, it is Great Britain, not Germany, that occupies neutral Norway. After the political end of Neville Chamberlain, it is Winston Churchill, who hated Germany and was very much against Hitler and Berlin, who holds all the strings of power in the British Empire. It is he who implements the actually existing plans for an occupation of Norway in our scenario before the Germans do. In our what-if, it is now London that uses Norway as an air force base against Germany and tries to cut off the Germans from the crucial iron transports. Berlin reacts with an attack and a blitzkrieg against Denmark, which is defeated and occupied within a few hours, just like in our real world. The occupation remains peaceful and relatively mild, as in actual history. Shortly afterward, follows the well-known Western campaign against France and Great Britain. In our scenario, the Nazis are also tremendously successful, and the Wehrmacht sweeps away the French army. At Dunkirk, they ultimately encircle hundreds of thousands of British soldiers. Unlike in actual reality, Hitler decides not to let the English army escape this time. All British soldiers are killed or captured, which is a huge blow to British morale and their ability to continue the war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who would later be used for a long war against Germany, are taken prisoner. With this bargaining chip in hand and German soldiers in France, the war in Western Europe is virtually over. Although British and German pilots do engage in air battles over Norway and the North Seas, the famous Battle of Britain never occurs. The loss of the British army at Dunkirk is such a huge blow to Churchill's prestige that he is forced to resign. The new British government responds to the many peace offers made by Hitler and first signs a ceasefire with Germany, which ultimately leads to real peace negotiations in the autumn of 1940. Germany never had a serious interest in the colonial possessions of the British Empire. The slogan issued by Churchill, that Germany's victory would threaten the empire, is unfounded. Consequently, the peace negotiations are shaped so that Germany demands from London the recognition of its European conquests. In this scenario, London agrees that Germany can keep its conquests in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Alsace, while Denmark, the Benelux countries, and parts of France are nominally annexed as Reich protectorates, but retain a certain degree of independence. In return, Berlin recognizes that Great Britain maintains undisputed rule over its colonial possessions. Germany therefore never participates in the Italian campaigns in North Africa. The relationship with Mussolini's Italy is not so close, and the Wehrmacht will never be used in North Africa against the British. The war remains limited to Europe, and Berlin's focus turns to the Soviet Union. Hitler always admired England and considered the British to be an Aryan people. At the same time, the enthusiasm for war in England was initially not great. The shock of the First World War and the loss of nearly 1 million men was still deeply felt. With the peace with Germany, Great Britain lost nothing but retained its colonial empire, and henceforth concentrated its forces on maintaining this empire, while simultaneously knowing that Germany had almost no chance of conquering the British Isles. A landing operation, as the Germans also knew, would be costly and almost impossible. In our scenario, instead, one finds many commonalities between London, Berlin, Rome, and other countries such as Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Spain, and Vichy France. The rejection of communism, the establishment of a supranational European idea of superiority, of Christian heritage, and of European civilization, which must be defended against the barbarians from the East and South, is shared by many governments and people in this era. Fascism and authoritarianism have found many followers in many countries of Europe by 1940. Simultaneously, Moscow's invasion of Karelia and Finland shows that the threat of communism affects all of Europe. Based on these foundations, anti-communism and the idea of European civilization, it is not too difficult for Berlin to find allies for a campaign against the Soviet Union. In our timeline, fascist organizations like Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists experience a surge in popularity and receive approval from the population in many European countries, spurred by Germany's apparent superiority. As in reality, these governments also engage in repression against Jews, other minorities, and political opponents in this timeline. Communists, socialists, and other anti-socials are mercilessly persecuted, killed, or imprisoned in countries controlled by Germany and its allies like Bulgaria, Romania, and Italy. By 1941, Berlin controls a territory stretching from the western Atlantic to the eastern Baltic and considers its territorial claims satisfied. However, it is clear to all that a war with the Soviet Union is inevitable. In the winter of 1941, Moscow conquers the small Baltic republics of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, positioning itself for a major campaign against Germany and the rest of Europe. Unlike in actual history, in this timeline, there is no firm alliance between Germany and Japan. They are ideologically close, but that's about it. When Japan carries out its attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany does not declare war on the USA in this timeline. With the existing peace between London and Berlin and their apparent non-involvement in the European conflict, the USA has no reason to intervene. Washington wages a war against Japan in the Pacific from 1941, ultimately winning it in 1945. As it is not involved in the European war against the USSR, the USA has all resources available to defeat Japan even slightly faster. The USA rises as the ruler of the Pacific, but largely stays out of European affairs. There is no arms aid or other assistance to the Soviet Union when it is attacked in the spring of 1942 by Germany and several of its allies like Bulgaria, Romania, and volunteers from Italian, French, Dutch, Danish, and British Waffen-SS divisions. Berlin, in this timeline, believes that it narrowly preempted a major Soviet attack and had to act preventively. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union is not an opponent to be underestimated for Germany. Operation Barbarossa initially goes very well for the Wehrmacht and Allied armies. Along with the Finns, who liberate the Baltic, Germany frees Ukraine, Belarus, and large parts of Russia from the yoke of Stalinism. In many areas, the Germans and other Europeans are welcomed as liberators. The armies of Greater Germany march from victory to victory. However, in the real timeline, it was, among other things, the rampant racial hatred of the Nazis towards the Slavs, the oppression of the local population by the ideological executioners of the Death's Head SS, and the disregard for regional identities that led to the initial enthusiasm quickly turning into bitter resistance. Therefore, in our own timeline, the behavior of the German leadership would be different. The Reich government decides in our case that Poland can continue as a protectorate with its own regional government and without access to the sea, while it does not annex the areas liberated from the Soviet Union, but develops them into buffer states and helps them to their own national independence dependent on Berlin. Ukraine and Belarus become independent states that are to function as front states against communism from the Deep East. By 1943, it becomes clear that the Wehrmacht can defeat the Soviets in the field and even take Moscow, but it is unable to defeat the USSR and Stalin. The Red Army retreats behind the Urals by 1944, and the war continues at a lower intensity. Germany lacks the will and means to defeat the millions of soldiers of the Red Army and Stalin's communist regime, now led from Siberia. Nevertheless, due to the applied leniency and respect for the local population in the East, the Wehrmacht does not face the same difficulties as in real history. The Waffen-SS recruits vast numbers of volunteers from the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, and Berlin uses the small but German-supported armies of Free Ukraine and Free Belarus for its border war against the remnants of the Red Army, a war that will still not be nearing an end in 1946. Without Stalin in Moscow and the Red Army in Europe, Germany is victorious. World War II is won, without really becoming a world war because the USA did not participate in the war in Europe. Essentially, there were two parallel wars in Asia and Europe. China never becomes communist, but is ruled by nationalist forces that in the real timeline had to flee to Taiwan. And what does Europe, now governed by Germany, actually look like in this timeline? Even in this timeline, mass persecution of Jews, Sinti, and Roma occurs. Thousands are killed, millions are driven out of Europe. With the victory over the Red Army in the European part of Russia, Hitler has the opportunity to carry out extermination and expulsion deep in the Russian steppe. Many Jews manage to flee to the USA and other parts of the world. However, the crimes committed by the Nazis never become as widely known as in real history. Much is successfully covered up by the Nazi regime. As a result, apart from rumors, not much reaches the public, and the facade of a new, intact, and better era hardly cracks. And what does Europe, now governed by Germany, actually look like in this timeline? Even in this timeline, mass persecution of Jews, Sinti, and Roma occurs. Thousands are killed, millions are driven out of Europe. With the victory over the Red Army in the European part of Russia, Hitler has the opportunity to carry out extermination and expulsion deep in the Russian steppe. Many Jews manage to flee to the USA and other parts of the world. However, the crimes committed by the Nazis never become as widely known as in real history. Much is successfully covered up by the Nazi regime. As a result, apart from rumors, not much reaches the public, and the facade of a new, intact, and better era hardly cracks. In fact, Nazi Germany's victory in Europe leads to an economic upsurge similar to the 1950s and 1960s in our timeline. Germany's technological achievements spur the economy. For the Germans and their allies, a golden era of prosperity actually begins. Germany, alongside the USA and Great Britain, claims its place at the top of the world, ruling over an empire of nearly 160 million people in Europe. The economic boom, along with the conservative family policies of the Nazis, leads to strong population growth. The racial ideals of the Nazis are further promoted through Lebensborn programs, genetic technology, and selection. Liberal democracy, as we know it today, never gains much dominance in Europe, but remains a fringe phenomenon in countries like Switzerland or the Scandinavian countries. It's not a dark age that dawns, but an authoritarian rule that probably pleases most people, as long as they are Europeans and not communists. Neither socialism, the hippie movement, nor the demographic crisis materialize in this timeline in Europe. The USA, too, is less liberal compared to the mood in the world, and maintains normal, friendly trade relations with the Reich. Vichy France officially regains control of Paris and conducts a colonial war for its possessions, while also sending troops to the Waffen-SS, which continues a brutal border war against the Red Army in the east at the Urals. Europe in 1960 is likely more technologically advanced than in our timeline. It's not the Americans who land on the moon, but Werner von Braun and his Nazi colleagues, who launch not just a moon mission, but also a mission to Mars. Berlin becomes the center of a right-leaning, ideologically tight-knit New World Order, very much tailored to white Europeans. This world order has nothing to do with liberal democracies, and homosexuality, LGBTQ individuals, and others deemed unworthy of life by the Nazis have no place in this new order. So what do you think about our attempt at this what-if scenario? Does it sound plausible for you? Could you live in this alternative world with less personal freedom and under the yoke of the Nazis?